Opening the king's diagonal immediately signals an aggressive intent and prepares for rapid development. Opening the center immediately establishes symmetrical pawn tension, inviting an active fight for central squares. Opening the king's flank so boldly invites immediate tactical fireworks and a sharp battle for central control. A bold recapture, immediately opening the f-file and sacrificing pawn structure for tempo in the king's gambit. Developing a knight immediately addresses central control and prepares for castling, a sound response to black's ambitious gambit. Developing the king's pawn creates central space and prepares bishop development, a solidifying response after the gambit. Asserting central influence, d4 grabs space and opens diagonals for pieces, a principled response to black's aggressive king's gambit setup. Black embraces the wild, sacrificing pawn structure for attacking energy aimed at white's king. Unleashing an aggressive pawn storm, white seizes the initiative by challenging black's pawn chain and opening lines towards the enemy king. Pushing the pawn further now imprisons your own bishop, sacrificing valuable piece development for a fleeting attack. Retreating the knight to the edge sacrifices tempo and concedes the initiative to black's aggressive pawn storm. Unleashing a pawn storm, black sacrifices material to shatter white's kingside pawn structure and seize attacking momentum. Unleashing a bishop, this move eyes black's developing pieces, aiming to disrupt coordination and exploit the kingside pawn structure's chaos. Solidifying central control and preparing for kingside castling offers excellent defensive solidity. Unleashing the queen aims to exploit the open files, but watch for black's developing threats against your exposed king. Challenging white's bishop directly, this pawn advance attempts to disrupt coordination and potentially gain space on the king side. Clearing lines around the weakened black king, a calculated risk to expose weaknesses. Unleashing a pawn storm, black ignites a kingside attack, yet exposes their own monarch. Snatching back the pawn, white immediately resolves the immediate tension and prepares to bring more pieces into the fray. Developing the knight to this active square puts pressure on white's central pawns and prepares for a kingside attack. Developing the knight to its natural outpost aims to bolster the center and prepare for pawn pushes that might unlock the king's defenses. Unleashing the knight to a central outpost, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and coordinate an attack on the king side. Repositioning the queen offers attacking potential and prepares for kingside pawn advances, aiming to crack open black's defenses. Seeking centralization, this knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing potential outpost and supporting the g-pawn's advance. Pushing the pawn to h5 gambles with pawn structure, seeking space but potentially weakening the kingside further. Reconsolidating the knight to f8, a less active square, concedes central space and allows white to build pressure. Recapturing the pawn solidifies central control and prepares to contest the kingside initiative. Unleashing the queen creates immediate threats, potentially unbalancing white's fragile pawn shield. Unleashing the queen's diagonal pressure, white aims to exploit the f8 knight's restricted mobility and prepare for an attack on the kingside. Solidifying the knight's advance, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's kingside pressure and prepare for a counterattack on the center. Unlocking the kingside and castling onto the open file finally injects some activity into white's position, preparing for a potential queenside counterplay. Unleashing a forcing check, black disrupts white's castled king and demands an immediate answer, potentially exposing vulnerabilities in white's kingside defense. Relocating the king from the open file shores up the queenside and prepares for a safer castled position. Developing the knight to a more active square, preparing for counterplay and contesting the center. Unleashing the central pawn swarm, white aggressively challenges black's pawn chain and seeks to pry open lines toward the besieged monarch. Opening a vital diagonal for your queen, this daring pawn thrust aggressively challenges white's central structure. Unlocking the d-file offers attacking potential, but you must be wary of the exposed king. Reclaiming central influence is the priority now, but the knight's journey is perilous. This bold thrust opens a vital line, forcing black's queen into a precarious defensive posture. Prioritizing pawn protection over active piece development creates a static, somewhat awkward pawn structure. Disrupting black's knight formation, this maneuver aims to open the center and exploit the exposed king. This decision reasserts queen activity, aiming to exploit the open central files and pressure white's uncastled king. Repositioning the rook to a more central square prepares for potential pawn pushes and greater influence on the d-file. Unleashing the knight to g5 presents a bold, albeit risky, counter-initiative on the queen side, daring white to expose their king further. Unleashing a powerful knight fork, this check aims to disrupt black's coordination and seize material. Relinquishing central control to shepherd the king through this messy middle-game jungle. Finally, the knight penetrates, disrupting black's pawn shield and eyeing weaknesses. Black reinforces the central pawn structure, creating a more solid foothold for the king's defense while preparing for future action. Unlocking the f-file, white boldly seeks to disrupt black's slumbering queenside. Prioritizing king's safety becomes paramount as black tucks their monarch away from the attacking knight's reach, preparing for future defensive maneuvers. Clearing the d-file opens lines for potentially devastating rook invasions, especially towards the exposed black king. The queen repositions, seeking safety and preparing for a potential counterplay on the king side, but momentarily leaves the d-file exposed. The rook now anchors a powerful outpost on the 7th rank, menacing the exposed black king. Swapping queens now offers a brief respite, but the exposed black monarch remains a significant concern. Unveiling the king's sanctuary, this checks its escape routes. King's safety becomes the paramount concern, forcing a defensive reshuffling of black's pieces to avoid immediate tactical exposure. Decimating the queen's defense, this exchange forces black's king into a precarious, exposed position. Cornering the monarch, white forces a decisive king march, creating immediate threats and disarray. Recapturing this pawn seals the pawn structure and initiates an endgame where white's knights will have greater mobility. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal now solidifies black's center control and prepares for potential counterplay. Stepping the king to c1 secures it from potential checks and prepares for piece redeployment, a prudent defensive maneuver. Reasserting central control and preparing to contest the open e-file is crucial now. Activating the rook to the 4th rank seizes open lines and pressures black's vulnerable pawn structure. Repositioning the bishop to the queenside seeks to solidify defenses and potentially participate in a future queenside pawn storm. Kinging into the center activates a crucial piece for the endgame's defensive and offensive potential. The rook's repositioning aims to challenge white's pawn chain and potentially open the rook's file for future action. Targeting the weak pawn on g4, this knight maneuver aims to disrupt black's structure while reinforcing white's attacking potential. King seeking shelter behind the pawns, a prudent retreat from the active rook. Anchoring the bishop to f1 solidifies the queenside pawn structure and prepares for potential king safety maneuvers. Challenging white's entrenched knight with this pawn thrust opens up the c-file and seeks counterplay. Challenging the pinned knight forces a choice between awkward retreat or an exposed king. Protecting the king from further checks and allowing the rook to become active again is a sensible reaction. Unleashing a knight's fork to disrupt the black position and seize material advantage. A developing piece joins the fray, aiming to bolster the cramped queenside pawns and initiate counterplay. Sacrificing the knight opens the h-file, threatening immediate checkmate and simplifying into a winning endgame. A desperate check aiming to disrupt the white king's sanctuary. King's centralizing mission now faces immediate counterpressure. Initiating a pawn thrust on the queenside aims to liberate the bishop and disrupt white's central control. Solidifying your queenside pawn structure prepares for the inevitable pawn advances and helps to prevent black's pieces from finding easy entry. Unleashing the queenside pawn majority, this advance challenges white's central stability and aims to create winning endgame prospects. Unleashing a pawn storm opens lines, but sacrifices material, forcing a calculation battle. Opening the queenside diagonal with this pawn thrust grants black an immediate outpost for their knight, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Unlocking the c-file offers a clear path to consolidate white's material advantage. Confronting the opposition's advanced pawn structure with an immediate king sortie. The white king scurries to safety, seeking refuge from the immediate threats on the queenside. A bold regrouping that aims to disrupt white's central control and develop counterplay on the queenside. Seizing the open file with the rook now seals black's fate, creating inevitable mating threats. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight opens up diagonal lines for the rook, creating immediate threats. Exploiting the open file, the rook crashes in, aiming to dismantle black's weakened kingside structure. The king's exposed position on the open file is a dire concern, demanding immediate defensive adjustments. Reclaiming the open knight outpost on f5 solidifies central control and prepares for aggressive advances. A final attempt to stir up a defense amidst this collapsing pawn structure. Unblocking the diagonal for the queen and preparing to re-establish rook presence on the 7th rank. Preparing to challenge the open files by bringing the queen's bishop pawn forward. Reinforcing the queenside pawn structure prevents immediate threats and prepares for potential pawn pushes. A bold attempt to activate the rook by swinging it across the board. Reclaiming the open file offers white a chance to reactivate the rook and press on the queenside. This knight suddenly finds an open highway to attack the king, potentially forcing a messy tactical skirmish. Securing the king's escape route is paramount, creating a fortress against the advancing pawns and potential checks. Capturing the pawn opens up new avenues for counterplay, though beware of white's exposed kingside. Sacrificing the rook offers a surprising checkmate threat that black must desperately parry. The king's safety is paramount. This pawn move might expose it to further checks. The rook now eyes the unprotected knight on a3, forcing a difficult decision for black. Pushing the passed pawn forward aims to create a diversion and potentially gain space, though it requires careful calculation. Repositioning the knight to a better square, preparing to escort the pawn and restrict black's counterplay. Snatching the knight opens a path for the rook to dominate the b-file and target the exposed king. King repositioning aims to consolidate the remaining material advantage. Consolidating the knight's position allows for a potential re-engagement on the kingside or a regrouping for defense. Elevating the pawn to h6 attempts to solidify the kingside pawn structure and restrict black's knight. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank offers better defensive coverage and prepares a counterattack. Securing the rook's new outpost on the 4th rank is key to suffocating black's remaining play. The king scrambles for safety, but a pawn advances, creating new threats and a desperate race. Challenging the knight's outpost opens up lines for potential material gains. Finally, a chance to untangle the rook and threaten the overextended knight. Clearing the rank allows the rook to support the passed pawn's advance. The knight now seeks refuge on the queenside, aiming to support the advancing pawns and create counterplay. This knight retreat aims to reposition aggressively, preparing to support the passed pawn's advance and exploit black's potentially exposed king. Unleashing the rook to the 2nd rank now aims to disrupt white's pawns. Unleashing the king with a check creates an immediate tactical advantage, forcing black to address the imminent threats. King's safety has evaporated, leaving the monarch exposed to the relentless pawns marching forward. The knight's advance targets the vulnerable pawn and hints at a potential kingside squeeze. The knight's retreat to d6 aims to reclaim defensive duties on the queenside, while potentially supporting a pawn advance. Securing the central dark squares with this knight maneuver aims to solidify white's pawn structure and prevent black's counterplay.